Operation Ivy Bells. Operation Ivy Bells was one of the most daring and technologically sophisticated espionage missions of the Cold War. Conceived during the 1970s, it involved the U.S. Navy and the National Security Agency, NSA, working in close coordination to tap into secret Soviet undersea communication lines. American intelligence had discovered that the Soviet military used a heavily guarded underwater cable to transmit communications between their submarine base at Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Naval Command Center in Vladivostok. This cable, lying deep beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, was believed by the Soviets to be completely secure. After all, it was located within Soviet territorial waters, which were under constant patrol and surveillance. The assumption was that no foreign power could ever reach it, let alone tamper with it. That assumption would prove disastrously wrong. The United States, seeing a rare opportunity to gain direct access to unencrypted Soviet military communications, developed a highly classified plan to place a listening device directly on the cable. They selected the USS Halibut, a specially modified submarine equipped for deep-sea intelligence missions, as the vessel to carry out this ambitious task. The Halibut was outfitted with advanced sonar, underwater photography systems, and robotic arms, and its crew was trained in stealth operations under extreme pressure. The mission was treacherous. The sub had to infiltrate the heavily monitored Sea of Okhotsk, locate the undersea cable on the ocean floor hundreds of feet below, and place a recording pod around it without leaving a trace. Divers, working in near total darkness and freezing temperatures, descended to the ocean bed, found the cable, and secured a sophisticated tapping device that didn't physically penetrate the cable, but captured signal leakage from it. Once installed, the device recorded weeks of high-level Soviet conversations. These recordings were later retrieved by returning U.S. subs, analyzed by the NSA, and revealed stunning intelligence. Soviet commanders and political officers discussed fleet deployments, nuclear capabilities, strategic decisions, and even personal grievances, all under the assumption that their lines were private. The information proved invaluable to U.S. defense planners, allowing a rare glimpse into the operational mindset of America's greatest adversary. For years, Operation Ivy Bells remained undetected, continuing to yield a stream of sensitive intelligence data that many analysts described as priceless. However, in 1980, the operation came to an abrupt end due to betrayal from within. Ronald Pelton, a former NSA analyst facing severe financial troubles, approached the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and sold secrets about the wiretap operation for a paltry sum. His treason exposed the tap's location and existence. When U.S. submarines returned to retrieve the recording device, they found it had vanished, removed by Soviet divers who now knew they had been eavesdropped on for years. Pelton was eventually apprehended and sentenced to life in prison, but the intelligence pipeline was lost forever. Operation Ivy Bells stands today not only as a testament to American ingenuity and technical mastery, but also as a sobering reminder of how espionage victories can unravel through the weaknesses of a single individual. Project Azorian, Operation Jennifer. Few Cold War operations match the scale, secrecy, and sheer audacity of Project Azorian, a CIA-led mission that attempted the unthinkable: recover a sunken Soviet submarine from more than 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. In March 1968, the Soviet submarine K-129, a Golf II-class ballistic missile sub, mysteriously disappeared in the North Pacific. Unknown to the Soviet Navy, American underwater listening stations had detected the acoustic signature of the disaster, allowing the United States to locate the wreck hundreds of miles northwest of Hawaii, at a depth of over 16,000 feet. The implications were enormous. If the U.S. could somehow retrieve the submarine, or even part of it, they might gain access to Soviet nuclear weapons, codebooks, cryptographic systems, and critical intelligence on submarine design. The CIA proposed an extraordinarily ambitious and costly solution. With assistance from billionaire Howard Hughes, they created a cover story. A civilian enterprise would mine the ocean floor for valuable minerals. To this end, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a massive and seemingly legitimate deep-sea mining ship, was constructed. In reality, the ship was a front for one of the most technologically complex espionage missions in history. Hidden beneath its hull was a gigantic mechanical claw system designed to descend 16,000 feet to the ocean floor, grasp the submarine, and lift it into a hidden moon pool inside the ship, all without alerting the Soviets. The operation was launched in 1974. As the Glomar Explorer reached the recovery site in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the crew began the long, slow process of lowering the claw system, nicknamed Clementine, to the depths below. After a tense and painstaking maneuver, the device successfully latched onto the sunken sub. However, tragedy struck during the lift. A section of the sub broke off and fell back to the seafloor, beyond the reach of recovery. Only a portion of the K-129 was brought to the surface. Though it's still classified what exactly was recovered, many believe that the U.S. retrieved several nuclear-tipped torpedoes and valuable intelligence materials. Others argue that the mission yielded more symbolic than strategic value. In a moment of surprising humanity, the CIA ensured that the bodies of several Soviet sailors recovered during the mission were given a proper burial at sea with full military honors. The entire mission was kept secret until it was partially exposed in 1975 by journalists investigating CIA activities. When questioned about the recovery mission, the CIA issued a now famous response: "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such an operation." This phrase, the Glomar response, has since become a standard way for government agencies to handle inquiries into classified matters. To this day, Project Azorian remains one of the most ambitious covert operations ever attempted. It was a feat of engineering, logistics, and secrecy that pushed the boundaries of what was technologically possible in the 1970s. Though the full extent of what was retrieved remains unknown, the mission sent a clear signal to the Soviets and the world that the United States was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to gain an advantage in the Cold War's shadowy war of intelligence. Operation Chrome Dome Operation. Chrome Dome was one of the most dangerous and controversial Cold War initiatives undertaken by the United States. Launched in the early 1960s, this operation involved a constant airborne alert in which U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress bombers, armed with thermonuclear weapons, flew continuous routes around the globe. The purpose was to ensure that, in the event of a sudden Soviet nuclear strike, such as a decapitating first strike that destroyed command and control centers, there would still be American bombers in the sky, ready to retaliate with devastating force. These bombers operated under the Strategic Air Command, SAC, and circled routes over Greenland, Canada, the North Pole, and the Arctic, staying in the air 24/7, year after year. It was a policy based on the chilling logic of mutually assured destruction. If the U.S. was always prepared to strike back, the Soviets would be deterred from striking first. At its peak, dozens of bombers were in the air at any given moment, with each aircraft carrying multiple nuclear warheads. The missions were timed and coordinated with mid-air refueling to allow continuous global presence. But this high-stakes operation was not without its costs. The combination of constant pressure, mechanical wear, and the inherent danger of nuclear arms created a perfect storm of risk. Several near-catastrophic incidents occurred during Chrome Dome, exposing just how perilous the policy really was. One of the most infamous accidents happened on January 17, 1966, near Palomares, Spain. A B-52 bomber collided mid-air with a KC-135 tanker during refueling, resulting in the death of 7 crew members and the accidental release of 4 hydrogen bombs. While the warheads did not detonate, 2 of them ruptured upon impact, spreading plutonium-laced radioactive material across the Spanish countryside. The U.S. military launched an enormous and urgent cleanup effort, even removing large sections of contaminated soil and shipping them back to the U.S. for disposal. The incident caused a diplomatic crisis and raised public concern about the safety of U.S. nuclear operations. Another near disaster occurred in 1968, when a B-52 bomber crashed on the ice near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The crash released radioactive debris into the Arctic environment and required another massive and secretive cleanup. These accidents underscored the enormous risks associated with having nuclear-armed planes in the air around the clock. Even though none of the warheads exploded in these incidents, The potential for a full-scale catastrophe loomed large. As technology advanced, and the U.S. nuclear triad was bolstered with improvements in intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, the need for constant airborne alert diminished. By 1968, after growing public and political pressure, Operation Chrome Dome was quietly terminated. Still, for nearly a decade, the skies were filled with doomsday bombers ready to unleash hell within minutes. Chrome Dome serves as a haunting example of just how close the world stood to nuclear devastation, not just from enemy action, but from the internal hazards of deterrence itself. Operation Paperclip was one of the most ethically complicated and strategically vital intelligence undertakings in the aftermath of World War II. Initiated in 1945 by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, this top-secret operation aimed to recruit and extract German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had worked directly for the Nazi regime, to serve the United States during the Cold War. These men were not ordinary academics. They were some of Hitler's top scientific minds, responsible for innovations in rocketry, aeronautics, medicine, and chemical warfare. Most notably among them was Wernher von Braun, the mastermind behind Germany's V-2 rocket program, which had terrorized London and Antwerp during the war. The decision to bring Nazi scientists to America was controversial and morally troubling. Many of the men targeted for recruitment were active members of the Nazi Party, and some were directly involved in atrocities, including human experimentation and forced labor. However, as the Cold War escalated and the U.S. feared Soviet technological advances, particularly in missile development and atomic science, American officials made a calculated decision. Securing scientific superiority was more important than moral purity. Under Paperclip, more than 1,600 scientists and their families were relocated to the United States, where their past affiliations were whitewashed or ignored. Background checks were altered or sanitized to allow them to enter the country and begin work for various branches of the U.S. military and government. Wernher von Braun and his team became instrumental in the development of American ballistic missile technology. Later, they played a central role in the creation of NASA and the U.S. space program. Von Braun himself designed the Saturn V rocket, which carried astronauts to the moon during the Apollo missions, a towering achievement in human history made possible, paradoxically, by the genius of a former Nazi officer. Other Paperclip scientists contributed to advancements in jet propulsion, nuclear physics, and biological warfare research. The ethical implications of Operation Paperclip continue to provoke debate. On one hand, the operation undeniably gave the United States a critical edge over the Soviet Union in both military and space technologies. On the other, it involved compromising post-war justice and sheltering men who had, in some cases, been complicit in war crimes. The operation was kept secret for decades, and only in the 1980s did more details begin to emerge, sparking renewed public scrutiny and historical reassessment. Operation Paperclip reveals the murky intersection between science, war, and morality. It illustrates the extent to which both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were willing to exploit the knowledge of the defeated Nazi regime in their desperate pursuit of Cold War dominance. It also serves as a reminder that the race for technological superiority often comes with moral costs that cannot be easily justified or forgotten. Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods stands as one of the most chilling and controversial proposals ever developed by the U.S. military during the Cold War. Conceived in 1962 by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the plan outlined a series of false flag operations intended to manipulate public opinion and justify a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. At the time, the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro had solidified its alliance with the Soviet Union, transforming the island nation into a communist foothold just 90 miles from Florida. This development had deeply alarmed the U.S. government, especially after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. In response, top military brass sought increasingly extreme measures to remove Castro from power. Operation Northwoods proposed fabricating a series of attacks on American citizens and military targets, which would then be blamed on the Cuban government. The document, declassified decades later, included stunningly detailed plans, hijacking commercial airliners and crashing them to simulate Cuban terrorism, blowing up a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay, staging mock funerals for fake victims, orchestrating bombings in American cities, and even manufacturing fake evidence of Cuban involvement through planted materials. The goal was simple: galvanize public outrage and build political momentum for a military campaign against Cuba. What makes Operation Northwoods especially disturbing is the cold, methodical tone of its proposals. The planners didn't merely speculate about false flag possibilities. They laid out exact scenarios, timetables, and even budget estimates. These were not wild ideas tossed around in secret rooms. The plan reached the highest levels of the Pentagon and was formally presented to civilian leadership. It was only thanks to President John F. Kennedy and Secretary McNamara's strong opposition that the plan was never approved. Kennedy, increasingly distrustful of the military-industrial complex, rejected the proposal outright. But the fact that it reached his desk at all is a profound reminder of how far some within the U.S. defense establishment were willing to go during the Cold War to achieve geopolitical aims. Operation Northwoods was classified for nearly 40 years, until it was revealed in the 1990s through Freedom of Information Act requests. Its exposure triggered outrage, skepticism toward official narratives, and renewed debate about the use of deception in wartime strategy. While it was never carried out, the plan left an indelible stain on the record of Cold War policymaking. It demonstrated that the threat of communism had created an atmosphere so tense, so paranoiac, that even the unthinkable could be written into military proposals. Northwoods became a symbol of unchecked power, of how the lines between defense and aggression, truth and fabrication, could dangerously blur in the pursuit of national interest. Operation Gladio is one of the most mysterious and far-reaching covert operations ever uncovered in post-war Europe. A shadowy campaign born from the fear of communist expansion during the Cold War. Officially, Gladio was the code name for a clandestine NATO program initiated in the late 1940s to create stay-behind armies in Western European countries. These secret paramilitary networks were designed to wage guerrilla warfare in the event of a Soviet invasion. While the core concept may have had defensive intentions, the reality of Gladio's activities went far beyond passive resistance. It evolved into a covert mechanism for manipulating European politics, destabilizing leftist movements, and, most disturbingly, allegedly supporting acts of terrorism under false pretenses. At its core, Operation Gladio was coordinated by NATO and the CIA in collaboration with the intelligence services of several European nations, including Italy, France, Germany, and Belgium. Members of these stay-behind units were recruited from former military personnel, anti-communist partisans, and sometimes even fascist sympathizers. They were trained in sabotage, assassination, and guerrilla tactics, and their arsenals, hidden in secret arms caches throughout Europe, included explosives, firearms, and radios for encrypted communication. The intention was to resist Soviet occupation. But as time passed and no invasion came, the mission morphed into something far darker. In Italy, evidence emerged linking Gladio operatives to a series of violent incidents during the so-called Years of Lead, Anni di Piombo, a period from the late 1960s to the 1980s marked by bombings, assassinations, and political kidnappings. One of the most infamous attacks was the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed 85 people. While the perpetrators were initially believed to be far-right extremists, later investigations suggested links between Gladio-connected groups and elements within Italian intelligence. These events gave rise to the strategy of tension, a theory that Gladio operatives deliberately committed or facilitated acts of terrorism to create fear, discredit left-wing parties, and justify authoritarian crackdowns in the name of public safety. The exposure of Operation Gladio in the early 1990s, following testimony in the Italian parliament and revelations by Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, stunned the world. European citizens were horrified to learn that their governments had participated in or allowed secret armies to operate outside democratic oversight, possibly even turning their weapons on their own people. Inquiries were launched across Europe, but many records remained classified or conveniently lost. The full extent of Gladio's operations is still not entirely known, and its existence has fueled countless conspiracy theories about state-sponsored terrorism and the manipulation of democratic institutions. Operation Gladio is not just a footnote in Cold War history. It is a cautionary tale of how secrecy, ideology, and fear can combine to form networks of power operating beyond public scrutiny. While it was originally conceived as a defense mechanism against external tyranny, it became, in many ways, a tool of internal subversion. The legacy of Gladio continues to haunt modern European politics, reminding us that in the battle against perceived threats, democracies can sometimes become what they fear. Operation Mongoose was a covert program launched by the United States in 1961, following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis. Its primary goal was to destabilize the communist regime of Fidel Castro and ultimately remove him from power. What made Mongoose particularly dangerous was the breadth of operations it encompassed, from assassination attempts to psychological warfare, sabotage, and the fostering of anti-Castro uprisings within Cuba. The operation was not just about gathering intelligence. It aimed at complete regime change, and it involved almost every branch of the U.S. government, from the CIA to the military, and even the mafia. The scope of Operation Mongoose's activities was staggering. The CIA, under the direction of then-President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, took an all-encompassing approach to the Cuban issue. The operation involved the training of Cuban exiles to carry out sabotage operations within Cuba, with the goal of disrupting its economy and military infrastructure. One of the most infamous tactics involved the use of explosives to damage Cuban infrastructure, such as power plants and oil refineries. The CIA also attempted to create widespread instability through psychological warfare tactics, such as spreading false information and creating panic among the Cuban population. One of the darkest aspects of Operation Mongoose, however, was its relentless pursuit of attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. The operation became known for its more bizarre and sinister strategies, including poisoning his food, using explosive cigars, and even attempting to infect him with a deadly disease through contaminated clothing. These assassination attempts were numerous, but all ultimately failed. Castro was known for his resilience, and many believed his ability to survive the numerous assassination attempts became almost legendary in its own right. The operation also involved efforts to create internal strife in Cuba by supporting anti-Castro resistance groups. These efforts, however, failed to gain significant traction within Cuba. As the years went by, the operation's tactics became increasingly desperate, and the U.S. government faced mounting pressure to find a more sustainable way to address the Cuban situation. The operation was eventually abandoned in the mid-1960s, but its legacy continued to haunt U.S.-Cuban relations for years. Operation Mongoose stands as a powerful reminder of the lengths to which the U.S. government was willing to go to dismantle a regime that had aligned itself with the Soviet Union. It reflects the high-stakes nature of Cold War politics, where secret operations and shadow wars were common tools of diplomacy and control. The operation's failure, particularly its inability to overthrow Castro, was a major blow to U.S. intelligence and military prestige, but it also highlighted the complex and dangerous nature of American foreign policy during the Cold War. Operation Cyclone was a covert CIA program that ran from 1979 to 1989, and it stands as one of the longest-running and most consequential intelligence operations in modern history. Its primary goal was to support the Afghan Mujahideen fighters in their war against the Soviet Union, which had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. What made Cyclone particularly significant was its scale. The CIA channeled billions of dollars in aid to the Mujahideen, who were engaged in a brutal, asymmetric conflict with the Soviet forces. The operation was rooted in the United States' desire to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining influence in the region, thus furthering the Cold War rivalry between the two superpowers. The U.S. response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was swift and aggressive. The CIA, under the direction of the Carter and Reagan administrations, began providing significant amounts of financial, military, and logistical support to the Mujahideen fighters. The aid came in various forms, including advanced weaponry such as the iconic Stinger missiles, which were used to target Soviet helicopters and aircraft. The Mujahideen fighters, who had little access to modern military technology, were now equipped with high-powered weapons that allowed them to effectively challenge the Soviet forces. The scale of U.S. involvement was staggering. The CIA's budget for the operation was estimated to be over $3 billion, and the U.S. government worked in close cooperation with Pakistan's intelligence service, the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, which acted as a middleman for the aid and coordinated its delivery to the Afghan fighters. The Pakistani ISI played a crucial role in ensuring that the right groups of Mujahideen received the necessary training and equipment to carry out their guerrilla warfare campaigns against Soviet forces. The operation also involved other countries, including Saudi Arabia, which contributed both funds and religious support for the Mujahideen's cause. While the operation ultimately led to the Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, it also had significant long-term consequences that would haunt the region for decades to come. The U.S.-backed Mujahideen, who had been portrayed as heroic freedom fighters, soon fragmented into a multitude of competing factions. Many of these groups would later evolve into more radical elements, some of which formed the foundation for the Taliban and even Al-Qaeda. This unintended consequence of the operation left Afghanistan in a state of perpetual civil war, and the rise of extremist groups who had been funded and armed by the CIA would eventually have a profound impact on global security, culminating in the September 11 attacks in 2001. Operation Cyclone also remains a controversial aspect of Cold War history. While it was successful in achieving its immediate goals, pushing the Soviets out of Afghanistan, it also contributed to the rise of Islamic extremism and the destabilization of the region. The U.S. involvement in Afghanistan during the 1980s is often cited as a key factor in the subsequent chaos that has plagued the country for decades. The legacy of Operation Cyclone serves as a stark reminder of how well-meaning interventions in foreign conflicts can sometimes lead to unintended, catastrophic consequences. Operation Snow White. Operation Snow White was a covert intelligence and psychological warfare operation launched by the United States in the 1950s, with the goal of influencing the political landscape of Latin America and countering the growing influence of communism in the region. While many Cold War operations involved direct military intervention or espionage, Snow White focused more on subtle tactics like media manipulation, disinformation, and psychological operations. The operation was primarily aimed at the leadership of several Latin American countries, most notably in Guatemala, where left-wing movements were gaining traction in the face of U.S. opposition. The U.S. government, under the guidance of the CIA, believed that communism posed a direct threat to the stability and influence of the Western Hemisphere. In particular, Guatemala became a focal point of concern after the election of President Jacobo Arbenz in 1950. Arbenz had implemented several progressive reforms, including land redistribution policies that threatened the interests of the U.S.-backed United Fruit Company. His political ideology, while not explicitly communist, aligned closely with left-wing ideals, which caused alarm within the U.S. government. As a result, the CIA set out to destabilize his government through covert means, including the manipulation of the media and the distribution of anti-communist propaganda. Operation Snow White took the form of a carefully coordinated campaign of disinformation, designed to paint Arbenz as a communist sympathizer and undermine his popular support. The CIA worked with local media outlets to spread rumors, falsified stories, and fabricated evidence of Arbenz's ties to the Soviet Union. They also exploited fears of communism by orchestrating protests and encouraging anti-government sentiment among the population. In addition, the U.S. supported paramilitary groups and clandestine activities aimed at creating political unrest, which would weaken Arbenz's hold on power. The culmination of these efforts came in 1954 with the CIA-backed coup that ousted President Arbenz from power. The operation was successful in toppling the Guatemalan government, but it came at a significant cost. The aftermath of Operation Snow White led to decades of political instability in Guatemala, with a series of brutal military regimes taking control. The country was plunged into a civil war that lasted for more than 30 years, resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians. The U.S.-backed regimes that followed implemented widespread human rights abuses, including massacres, disappearances, and torture. Operation Snow White remains a deeply controversial chapter in the history of U.S. interventionism in Latin America. While the operation succeeded in its immediate goal of removing a left-wing government, it also contributed to the long-term destabilization of the region. The operation is often cited as a prime example of the U.S. using covert operations to achieve geopolitical goals without regard for the long-term consequences for the countries involved. The legacy of Operation Snow White continues to resonate in Latin American politics, where U.S. interventionism during the Cold War is viewed with suspicion and distrust.